Okay, so this is part two of chapter four, the drivers of the information security business. This one, like I've said during part one, is going to be significantly shorter than part one. There are only 13 slides, including this one, in this part two. Okay, so when we talk about assessing risks, threats, and vulnerabilities, there are various different management guides and stuff available to you. The Risk Management Guide for Information Technology Systems, which is the National Institute of Standards and Technology special publication. That's what NIST is, and the SP are the special publications, SP 800-30. It's part of the special publication 800 series reports. These products provide detailed guidance of what you should consider in risk management and risk assessment in computer security. The reports in this sequence include checklists, graphics, formulas, and references to U.S. regulatory issues. And one good thing about the SP 800 series is that quite a few of the different guides and documents that are in it don't just really apply to the federal government. If you wanted to start your own cybersecurity information security program from scratch, there are multiple guides, especially with the lower numbers, 800 dash less than 30, um, that really provide general guidance to you, and you could use them as your touchstone to create your own cybersecurity program. It mentions CCTA, Risk Analysis and Management Method, called CRAM. CRAM is a risk analysis method developed by the UK government. The best practices of the United Kingdom's government organizations are the basis of the first releases of the CRAM method and tool. People around the world have used CRAM. It is also the UK government's preferred risk analysis method. It's best suited for large organizations. The operationally critical threat, asset, and vulnerability evaluation, or OCTAV. This approach defines a risk-based strategic assessment and planning technique for security. OCTAV is a self-directed approach. There are two versions of OCTAV, OCTAV and OCTAV S. OCTAV is best suited for large organizations, whereas OCTAV S works well for organizations consisting of fewer than 100 people. The ISO standard, ISO IEC 2705, Information Security Risk Management, an ISO standard that describes International Standards Organization, that describes information security risk management in a generic manner. The documents include examples of approaches to information security risk assessment and lists of possible threats, vulnerabilities, and security controls. So when we talk about closing the information security gap, a security gap is the difference between the security controls in place and the controls you need to address vulnerabilities. Gap analysis is a comparison of the security controls in place and the controls you need to address all the identified threats. So here are the steps for conducting a gap analysis. Identify applicable elements of security policy and other standards. Assemble policy, standard, procedure, and guideline documents. Review and assess implementation of policy, standards, procedures, and guidelines. Collect the hardware and software inventory information. Interview users to assess their knowledge of and compliance with policies. That should be and. Comparing the current security environment with policies in place. Prioritizing identified gaps for resolution. And documenting and implementing the remedies to conform to policies. Now, there are several common reasons for gaps. Probably the biggest reason is lack of security training, resulting in a non-compliant behavior. People have to be trained to do what is right in an organization when it comes to cybersecurity. Intentional or negligent disregard of security policy. Unintended consequence of a control or policy change. Addition or modification of hardware or software without proper analysis. configuration changes that lack proper risk analysis, and changes to external requirements such as legislation, regulation, or industry standards that require control changes. You have to adhere to compliance laws. One of these, though, is not a law. But first of all, Sarbanes-Oxley, or SOX, this became law in July of 2002. It introduced sweeping changes to the way corporate governance and financial practices are regulated. It was established. Um, it established the Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. Again, this is for publicly traded companies on the New York Stock Exchange, the American Stock Exchange, NASDAQ. Um, for overseeing, regulating, inspecting, and disciplining accounting firms as auditors of public companies. This was a direct result of the Enron scandal of 2001. When it talks about public accounting firms, my first job out of the Army was with Arthur Andersen and Company, at that point, the third largest accounting firm in the world, one of the most respected organizations with regard to ethics in the world and in America. I was not an accountant. I worked in their information consulting division, and they were deeply involved in the Enron scandal. As a matter of fact, Arthur Andersen was criminally charged as an organization and was dissolved as a result of Enron. Um, uh, the part I worked in, the information consulting division, later became Andersen Consulting and is now known as Accenture. It was actually split apart from the company or from the firm, but a proud and a long-standing firm was brought down by this, and Sarbanes-Oxley was a direct response to that. HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, took effect in April 2006, governs the way doctors, hospitals, and other healthcare providers handle personal medical information. It requires that all medical records, billing, and patient information be handled in ways that maintain the patient's privacy. The Gramm-Leach-Bliley Act, GLBA, and by the way, when you see names like this, they're usually a Republican and a Democratic senator who come together, or a congressman, to create this. In this case, I believe Graham and Leach were the Republicans and Bliley was the Democrat. HIPAA is also known as Kennedy Kassebaum, obviously Ted Kennedy, the Democrat, and Nancy Kassebaum from Kansas, whose father actually ran for president, got wiped out in 1936 by FDR, but she was the Republican on that. Anyway, GLBA addresses information security concerns in the financial industry, requires that financial institutions provide their clients a privacy notice that explains what information the company gathers about the client, where it's shared, and how the company protects that information. Okay, so the Payment Card Industry Data Security Standard, PCI DSS, is not a government regulation. It is an industry standard. It affects any organization that processes or stores credit card information. It fosters consistent global data security measures. PCI DSS version 3.2 is comprehensive security standard that includes requirements for security management, policies, procedures, network architecture, software design, and other critical protective measures. If you want to accept credit cards from your customers, you really have to be adhering to the PCI DSS. And again, it's not a governmental standard. FISMA, the Federal Information Security Modernization Act of 2002, officially recognize the importance of information security to the national security and economic health of the U.S. I once used a very lengthy case study on FISMA for this class. I still have it. I'm not going to be using it this term. It is very lengthy. But anyway, it required every federal agency to develop and maintain formal information security programs, including security awareness efforts, secure access to computer resources, strict acceptable use policies, and formal incident response and contingency planning. The Government's Information Security Reform Act of 2000. So this focused on the management and evaluation of the security of unclassified and national security systems, formalized Office of Management and Budget security policies. And these are just some of them. There are a whole bunch of them listed in Chapter 4, and you're really going to be responsible to know every one of them, including the original, the Computer Fraud and Abuse Act of 1986. But these are just some of the more well-known compliance laws. Okay, so keeping private data confidential. Ensuring that we need to ensure the availability of the data and the integrity of the data, and that's very important. You cannot undo a confidentiality violation. Once somebody views confidential data, there's no way to remove those data from his or her memory. It just can't be done. Now we know about the three tenets of information security. We've already talked about this before: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. The basic purpose of this three-pronged approach is to maintain security by preventing unauthorized use of any protected resource. So when we talk about keeping private data confidential, some of the authentication controls, and remember, authentication and authorization are two different steps. And we will talk about authorization later when we talk about access controls in chapter 5, I believe it is. But authentication controls include passwords and PINs. This is how you get into a system, you know, proving that you are who you say you are. For example, my USA account requires user ID and password, and then a PIN. Smart cards are tokens, biometric devices. I've just read somewhere, I believe in dark reading, that some biometric devices, voice devices, can be hacked. Digital certificates, challenge response handshakes, Kerberos authentication, and one-time passwords. Authorization, what you can do in a system once you are authenticated into it. Authentication server rules and permissions, access control lists, intrusion detection and prevention, physical access control, connection access policy filters, and network traffic filters. So we have to worry about mobile workers and their use of personally owned devices. Mobility, of course, allows remote workers and employees to be connected to the IT infrastructure in almost real time. And one of the policies that's used for this is called Bring Your Own Device, or BYOD, where employees use their personally owned devices for business and personal use. So here are some of the concerns and policy definitions required for BYOD, and there are a whole lot more of them in the textbook. But data ownership, who owns the data? Who owns the data on your device? You, the company? Maybe you shouldn't put data from the company on your device. Antivirus management. Again, is the company forcing you to use a certain antivirus product on your device, on your smartphone, on your tablet? If they are, you should be using it. If not, they should have a list of recommended ones that you would use. We talk about support ownership. Employee owns the IT asset and all support and maintenance responsibilities unless reimbursement is approved by the organization. That creates a problem. What if the employee is not doing the proper maintenance, not doing the proper updates? So that creates an issue. Of course, privacy. One of the problems with privacy is that you're using your device in a corporate setting. Uh, are you entitled to privacy in that corporate setting while you're using your device on their system? User acceptance. One of the situations with this is whether you're going to be able to accept the different software packages that the company has and whether you can actually use them or not. That's an issue. Legal concerns. Whose data is it? Whose device? It's your device, but you're using it in the company environment. There are legal issues involved with that. Patch management. Software updates and patches are recommended and should be performed by the employee on his or her own device, as defined by company policy. Forensics. Employees must agree that their personally owned IT asset is part of a formal incident response investigation. The IT asset may be confiscated to conduct a thorough forensics investigation on the asset. Onboarding and offboarding. Basically, this has to do when you come into the company and when you leave it. The BYOD policy should be explained and agreed to during the HR onboarding process when you're becoming a member of the organization. Should also include handling, such as data wiping or data deletion of the personally owned IT asset during offboarding prior to the employee termination and removal of access controls. Architecture infrastructure considerations. Use of any personally owned IT asset must meet the organization's IT standards and may require installation of new software to assist with security. and acceptable use policies. Employees must abide by all organizational policies and procedures, in particular the organizational acceptable use policy. Now, endpoint and device security. For this slide, you need to see the complete list on pages 130 and 131 because I'm not going to go through all of it. But are you going to be required to do full device encryption? That could create a problem. Most obviously, if you don't want to get involved with device encryption or use it for your own data. Remote wiping. Install software that will enable organizations to enable the remote wiping of data or email in the event of the loss or theft of the device. Of course, GPS. You have to consider the fact that your company could be tracking you. Asset tracking. It's an asset now in the organization. Are they tracking what you do with it? Device access control requires that all personally owned devices conform to the organization's BYOD policy and have proper device access controls to access the IT asset itself. Removable storage. Use of a removable storage or data backups as defined in the organization's BYOD policy and acceptable use policy. Data backups of personal data are the responsibility of the employee. Okay, in summary, we talked about risk management and approaches, business impact analysis, continuity plan, disaster recovery plan, impact of risks, threats, vulnerabilities on the IT infrastructure, adhering to compliance laws and governance, and managing and mitigating risk. That concludes Chapter 4.